Howdy, folks. Some people hold the view that the writers of the four Gospels felt free to basically make stuff up, to freely shape the narratives they were writing about Jesus' life, either by manufacturing stories about his deeds or making up teachings and putting them on his lips. The idea is that they used the figure of Jesus as a vehicle for their own ideas, and they made up material to serve the perceived needs of their local Christian communities. It's easy to show that by the 2nd century there were a lot of people identifying themselves as Christians who did exactly that. That's why there are so many Gnostic Gospels that were written from the 2nd to the 4th century. But what about the 1st century canonical Gospels? Let's take a look. I should say a word about what I mean and what I don't mean. I'm talking about making stuff up out of whole cloth. The kinds of things that the authors of the Gnostic Gospels did, telling stories and making up sayings that have absolutely no relation to the historical Jesus and what he said and did. I'm not talking about paraphrasing what Jesus said, using different words to express the same thing, or simplifying a story by choosing not to record certain details about what happened, or telling a story from a certain point of view, or bringing out an implication, nuance, or meaning that others might not have brought out, or using a bit of literary artistry and reorganization in presenting the material. The Gospel authors did all those things, as it's easy to show. John may have done a bit more than the other three. What I'm talking about is fundamentally different. I'm talking about making stuff up. While the Gnostics may have been into that kind of thing, there are very good reasons to think that the authors of the canonical Gospels weren't. Let's look at a few reasons why. It's commonly thought that St. Paul wrote his epistles, or many of them, before the canonical Gospels were penned. If that's true, and if the Gospel writers felt free to make stuff up, then we have something rather hard to explain. St. Paul was an enormously influential individual in 1st century Christianity. He may have made more converts than any other apostle. If the Gospel writers had a loosey-goosey attitude towards material floating around in the Christian community, then we would expect ideas and sayings of St. Paul to get attributed to Jesus. We would especially expect to find that happening in the Gospel of Luke, because Luke was part of the Pauline circle, one of Paul's traveling companions. But we don't find that happening at all. One of the notable things about Jesus, as he's presented in the Gospels, is that he sounds very different from St. Paul. He has his own idiom, his own way of speaking and teaching, and it is markedly different than that of Paul. So either the Gospels were written quite a bit earlier than is commonly thought, or the authors didn't feel at liberty to freely attribute material to Jesus, or both. Let's look at a particular example, which is quite instructive. One of the controversies in the early church was whether you had to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. Did you have to get circumcised, observe the Jewish holy days, and keep its dietary laws? Whether or not you had to keep kosher was a big deal. In fact, God began to show St. Peter that the barriers keeping Jews and Gentiles apart were going away by giving him a vision of non-kosher animals and urging him to eat. St. Peter resisted the vision. Peter said, "No, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." St. Paul was also involved in the controversy, and in a big way. He was a champion of the idea that Gentiles did not need to become Jews in order to be Christians. It's a major theme in his letters. In fact, it's the main theme of his letters to the Romans and the Galatians, and it appears in other letters as well, like Ephesians. In Acts 15, the church held a council in Jerusalem that endorsed this view, which was championed both by St. Paul and St. Peter. But the controversy remained, and there were many Jews who felt that you still had to keep kosher, among other things. Given this, if the Gospel writers felt free to make stuff up and attribute it to Jesus to settle controversies in their local communities, you would expect to find a statement on Jesus' lips that explicitly declared that it's okay to eat non-kosher food. That statement might be borrowed from St. Paul, or it might be adapted from St. Peter's vision, or it might be made up independently of either. But that statement isn't there. Instead, we have a very interesting passage in chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark, where we read, "Now when the Pharisees gathered together to him, with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate and drank with hands defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all of the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they purify themselves, and there are many other traditions which they observe, the washing of cups and pots and vessels of bronze. And the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with hands defiled?" So we have a controversy occurring in Jesus' ministry regarding the proper way to observe Jewish cleanliness customs. This type of controversy was extremely common at the time, with different schools of thought in first-century Judaism advocating different positions. We know rather a lot about this type of controversy because the Talmud and the Dead Sea Scrolls are filled with disputes about ritual requirements and how they're to be observed. Apparently, the early Christian movement had a less restrictive view than that of the Pharisees and scribes in that they allowed people to eat without ritually washing their hands. In response to the challenge, Jesus delivers a blistering rebuke, and as part of that, we read, "And he called the people to him again, and said to them, 'Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a man which by going into him can defile him, but the things which come out of a man are what defile him.' And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, 'Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him? Since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and then passes on. Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, What comes out of a man is what defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, fornication, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All of these evil things come from within, and they defile a man." Did you notice the parenthetical comment that Mark, the author of the Gospel, made in the middle of Jesus' speech? Let's look at it again. Just after Jesus says, "Do you not see that whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach, and so passes on?" Mark adds, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Did you get that? In the middle of a speech about whether we need to wash our hands before eating, Mark draws a broader implication. Even though the subject under discussion is whether dirt from our hands will make us unclean before God, Mark takes the principle Jesus has enunciated, that nothing that comes into us from outside makes us unclean, and applies it not to dirt, but to food. If nothing we eat makes us unclean, then no food we eat will make us unclean. Thus, by implication, Jesus declared all foods clean. This is important because it shows us the kind of constraints that Mark felt himself to be writing under. He felt free to point out the unspoken implications of what Jesus had said, to take a principle that he'd established in one context and apply it in another, but he did not feel free to make stuff up. If he did, then he would have done so, because naysayers in his audience could always disagree with his implication and say, "I don't think Jesus meant that." A clear statement from Jesus would settle the matter, but an implication from something he said wouldn't necessarily do that. Yet Mark felt constrained to accurately represent what Jesus said and not to come up with theologically useful material and put it on Jesus' lips. So there's good evidence that the gospel authors did not feel free to make stuff up about Jesus. They didn't include material from St. Paul. They didn't, on one of the most controversial issues of their day, feel at liberty to do more than bring out the implications of what Jesus had said. They thus showed that they were trying to be faithful recorders and interpreters of what Jesus said and did, not wild-eyed visionaries that were using the figure of Jesus as a literary puppet to serve their own ends. In other words, they weren't Gnostics. If you like the information I've presented here, I'd invite you to join my Secret Information Club. In case you're not familiar with it, the Secret Information Club is a free service I operate by email. I send out fascinating information about the Catholic faith. In fact, the very first thing you'll get when you sign up is information about what Pope Benedict says about the book of Revelation. He has a lot of interesting things to say. So I'd encourage you to visit www.secretinfoclub.com, where you can find out more and sign up. Thank you.